Hello, Matthew Chalmers from Glasgow, just up the road there. I actually could have titled this talk given the same name as the project which is just starting, which is called A Population Approach to Ubicomp System Design, because the kind of principles or concepts I'm going to try and explain in this short talk are really the core ones inside this program grant, EPRC program grant that's just started with two universities, Glasgow and UCL. £4 million, 5 years, nine people, and far too many lawyers. So the core of what I'm going to talk about is about a new form of stochastic abstraction that reflects the way that real-world software is adapted by users when they're allowed to. It's an abstraction at the heart of computer science, really. It's about the software class. This new project, which just started, or starting, centers on a dynamic and stochastic treatment of class as a population of instances, rather like an animal species is an abstraction over a population of individual animals, kind of drawing from that kind of metaphorically. So I think this kind of approach may only work substantially well when you've got large-scale deployments of software, and I think that's why this talk is in this particular session. So if I can just start by a simple kind of starting point, which is to think about something like the well-known web browser Firefox. Now, in structural terms, what is it? Especially when you look at statistics, for example, here in 2011, according to one of the Firefox developer blogs, 85% of users had extended it with at least one module or component that extended its basic functionality. Now, I'll use module or plugin or add-in, add-on, various terms here, but often module, sometimes component would be better, kind of treat them roughly synonymously. The point I'm trying to get to here is, when you think about what Firefox is, there's no one single structural definition that defines what it is. If you think about the top levels of main class, you can't really define it as one single kind of thing. And there's no one pattern of use either, of course, because of the way that people use it, as well as how they change the software structure. And a similar situation occurs with Internet Explorer, Photoshop, a lot of other sort of well-known applications. So, with Firefox, that's more than 60 million users who have changed their software, doing end-user adaptation. Now, some platforms make end-user adaptation of software difficult, such as Apple's. But when it is made available, there does seem to be a substantial appetite for it, for adaptation that continues after deployment. Increasingly, it's not just about adaptation involving superficial patterns of use or superficial interface components, but quite deep software structure that can be changed. And that can mean, well, chaos. The scale, the variety, the dynamism of software in the wild, as we tend to call it, make for good things like customization, tailorability, but also consequences that are not so good. Users often do not know which modules to use or to change to suit their goals, or whether a program will crash after they make such changes. As a result of modules being from different developers, their combination may never have been tested prior to public use. Now, recently, my own research, or my group's research, including Don, who's going to talk later, has involved mobile and ubiquitous computing, and using popular styles of application, including games, to explore a number of more general or fundamental research issues. Our largest deployment was a game called Hungry Yoshi. It's a game to users, and I won't go into the details of it because that's actually not so important just now, but it was the way that, emphasizing the way that this game was designed as a vehicle for a way to explore research questions to do with how to explicitly expose infrastructure to users. Infrastructure usually hidden or assumed to be seamless in the design of applications and interfaces, and also to explore new techniques for iterative design and evaluation, engagement with users more generally. Distribution was via public repositories like the App Store, Cydia. We also used Facebook integration to assist our interaction with users. And this complemented our use of really heavy logging of system interaction and execution to engage with users, both for evaluation and for the development of new design features for the next version or new elements to fit into the application. So it's been running for, well, it's heading towards 2 years now, I guess, in its various forms. And we've collected quite a lot of data about what's happening out there with kind of a substantial number of users. It's actually kind of probably well above 185,000 just now, although there's a whole debate about what we mean by user here. And we can emphasize that, of course, a lot of people do this to instrument their systems and collect quantitative, objective log data about that system's use. But I want to emphasize that there are techniques that Don will talk about later that you don't have to be limited to that quantitative log data, that you can also encourage or give people incentives and easy ways to provide you with richer qualitative data about what that log data helps you understand what that log data really means. Another application we did was called Flexbook, which was tying in with Facebook, a mobile social networking app. And one of the things it was exploring was dynamic integration of software modules at runtime, as it says here. And we could have our own server providing those modules, or it could actually happen using ad hoc networks directly between phones. So what would happen was that this modular software could actually be changed during runtime in the course of use. That you could actually use the local network, find who's nearby or devices nearby running the same program, see what was around there, connect to one, find what modules they had, and then integrate them in. Sorry, let me just jump back. I went too far. So we were sharing software, allowing people to share software, but also let them comment on it, to review and give feedback on it, as well as, of course, implicitly logging their use of it. And also trying to use Facebook as a way to kind of show and encourage that kind of sharing of information about it. So here's a kind of this was actually a relatively small scale experiment to do with dynamic software structures and end user adaptation. These kind of things are possible even with a kind of restricted platform like Apple's. There may be legal complications, but we can get around them. I think the core problem really is that our practices, and most people's practices of design and use, are generally quite conservative and limited or defensive. Users, evaluators, and developers lack really useful or even enjoyable interactions that would help them understand the effects of adaptation on overall system interaction and performance, but also the consequent social interaction, and maybe the reason why people would do such changes, and therefore establish new structural patterns in their software that were effective to that end. So at the high level, I think there's a kind of lack of an abstraction that would let us model the varied uses, contexts, and structures of different program instances. Jump fast again. I want to be clear here, analyzing data is not really enough. Despite the many tools that let us log and analyze and discuss large-scale patterns of software and use, including everyday tools we've used, like Excel, but also our custom toolkits and kind of images from which we're here, I don't think there's anything out there that really gives us concrete support for the process of changing our software in accord with those patterns for use. How can we feed back into the work we do with tools such as code editors, IDEs, for example, Eclipse and Xcode? How can we feed back into the work that users do as they change and adapt their applications? And I think there's a fundamental reason why this feedback is so limited and problematic. The fundamental models that tools based on them are based on slightly weak or outdated assumptions about a program, or actually what a software class is. Practice seems to be ahead of what's happening in regard to mainstream approaches to software definition, design, and analysis, which are generally based on the structure of a program or class being the same wherever and whenever it's used. As structure becomes complex, for example, the configuration of plugin modules that make up an application, the result is what some people call plugin hell, or broken software dependencies, functions, uses, and user expectations. Evaluators and developers struggle to help because their basic models and tools are based on these weak or false assumptions with regard to what they're working with. Innovative new algorithms may not be implemented in flexible or customizable ways, as it's just too complex and too expensive. Users cannot be sure of what changes to make to suit their own goals, or whether or how a program will work after they make such changes. So I think we lack ways to reason predictably and support people in handling real-world structure and use. We lack tools for designers, evaluators, and users that support adaptation at this large scale and how they interact with each other. We lack principles and techniques that are informed by this and can deal with it. I'd also propose that we need some kind of more multidisciplinary or holistic approach to tackle a really complex problem: how to design and support change. to inform and support end-user adaptation, in particular by modeling and explaining which configurations and modules and patterns of use will and will not work, even in some limited sense. So what we're starting to explore is a new treatment of class as population, as something that's dynamic, stochastic, and coupled with programs in use, drawing inspiration from the biological concept of a species as a probabilistic abstraction based on family resemblances, which I'll get into a little bit more. So what we intend to do is to try and model or understand a deployed class, a set of instances, as a population, a probabilistic distribution of software structures and of the values assigned to those structures. It's a very, very simple example. Imagine you're going to the Edinburgh Festival pretty soon, and you actually get an application which is a guide for the festival called Edinburgh Festival Guide. And you may find that there's some core modules which occur in 100% of instances in that deployment. So they all have the modules called festival events and festival venues. But people have been plugging things in, so you find that 50% of instances have got this thing giving some bus information to the next venue on the schedule. And also another one, 40%, have quickest walking route. And all recorded instances have a variable mean location of use that show 90% of its values within Edinburgh, where the festival is. So we're trying to sort of start, these are very, very simple examples of richer definitions that there's variation that we can just accept, kind of a probabilistic in a way. The traditional class of structure concept is very, very tight and rigid in this kind of sense. A class is a structure, and when we're dealing with that, all instances conform to that structure. We have the data structures where variables are state, the code structure in terms of the methods, procedures, or functions that are composed there, and therefore there's got a structural description which allows certain patterns of interaction, potential behavior, and then end use. And this kind of fundamental assumption is, of course, that when you deploy that across and actually execute it on people's computers or phones or whatever, that there's exact matchup between the structure of the class definition and the structure of each instance. So there's necessary and sufficient structural conditions for class membership in this type of definition. I mean, it's interesting when you think about it, of course, there's an implicit and generally unproblematic assumption that the values of variables in different instances may vary over time on the basis of each instance's history of use. But not really, there's no kind of direct support for the way that actually structure may actually change itself. When you have this kind of uniformity, this kind of tight structure, then clearly you can test the class structure at a high level, and you only need to do that test in one place. Because what's true for the class is true for the instances, and so you have this huge methodological convenience there, this generalization you can make. It's efficient, it's simple. Unfortunately, or increasingly, it's not always true, because dynamic infrastructures, architectures for software, for example, the component-based architectures of Firefox, Internet Explorer, Photoshop, and so on, and the ones my group is experimenting with, mean that methods and data structures may vary over time on the basis of each instance's history of use. So we're now starting to try to see what happens when we borrow metaphorically from biology. So a trend that happened really, it was defined mostly in the 50s by people like Ernst Mayr, this thing called population thinking. Now there is kind of taken as read really that a species is that kind of unusual sort of abstraction in a way. A species, or an organism, an animal, is a varied and changing population of individuals, changing over time. Change in evolution is natural, it's ongoing. And each individual member, no one zebra is exactly the same in all ways as every other zebra. And in fact, that variation amongst individuals is what helps the species adapt. That variation is vital to the adaptation of this ongoing process of how that species survives in the world. Species are usually defined by not a really tight set of necessary and sufficient defining properties, but often by family resemblances among the attributes that you can observe amongst the different instances, different individuals. It's kind of quoting from a text in this, things that may be thought to be connected by one essential common feature may in fact be connected by a series of overlapping similarities, where no one feature is common to all, and that can be done with regard to species. So again, also emphasizing here that by talking about things like individual genes and size and color and shape, this is a human abstraction that we make over selected a real-world collection of members and attributes. We choose both rather than there being an inherent perfect set of members and features. So we're proposing to explore is class as population. We're drawing from this biological idea. So a software class will be considered as a varied and changing population of software instances. Class membership will be based on, can be based on family resemblance. So it's going to better represent or fit with the everyday practices of end user adaptation, but also more flexibility we gain in actually understanding what happens at a kind of formal level. By enriching the set of features used in classification to include the values assigned to software structures, rather than using their high-level structure alone, this widens our resources for formal definition to better correspond with people's everyday understanding, as we see it. So a membership based on family resemblance also directly supports or represents variation within a class, affording tool design that supports change and adaptation. And since the family resemblance approach subsumes the traditional approach, in that class membership based on uniform structure is a special case of that approach, our approach affords selective and informed choices as to where and when to apply established tools and techniques that actually rely and take advantage of uniformity that we want to be able to use too. So these are we consider to be desirable properties because we need to tap into people's use and understanding of software, but we also want to represent and support change in manageable ways that allow tool support. I also want to emphasize before moving on, we're not proposing sort of random creation of variants and consequent blind sort of Darwinian selection. Instead, all the people involved, developers, evaluators, users, collectively drive population change through their interactions, sharing, analyzing, discussing, choosing from, acting on information about software structures and uses. And I think this idea of this abstraction will gain its strength because of its position within new design practices, supported by new models and new algorithms and new analyses. It's that combination we're trying to set out in this project. So again, just to emphasize the basic point here about we're trying to really design to support variation and dynamism rather than kind of fight against it. Statements about one instance may not be true for another. For example, it's kind of giving sort of simple toy examples here. But also because the population is changing, perhaps because of what we've done. And we might advertise that a certain configuration is more robust than another one, and therefore crash rates may change over time as a result of our intervention. This is perfectly normal. And also results of different contexts may differ. That news may spread more quickly in one country than another. Modules in Spain crash less often than in the US or something like that. So that we're assuming that this kind of stuff is normal. That's what we should be handling all the time. So we're just going to compare again these two different forms of representation. We are sort of trying to directly, assuming that kind of variation and dynamism in regard to this match between the high-level class definition and the instances deployed out into the real world. And we're using probabilistic statements or models that are coupled directly fed by the log data streaming back, which will be at the core of new forms of design, analysis, and interaction. And this population concept is what is going to bridge together these bridge across between these different tools and interactions. To try and make it more concrete, I'm going to try and whiz through a little kind of scenario we're talking about here. So imagine we make an application called Fan Photo for football fans to allow them to share text and photographs during a match or matches. You can see, like Scott just said, "Oh, amazing goal," and just sharing this photograph of a player. We give it out to 100 people. They all start using it. At the same time, we're still developing new modules. One for using Facebook to share data, another one to use adult networks to share text, photos, and video more directly between phones. So initially, most people are in the large cluster, 97 of them, but a few, 3 participants, actually download new modules and show off, we'd expect. They're trying them out, and we're just kind of watching the log data as it comes back. We start to see this little subcluster forming. Within the IDE, this data is also streaming back into the IDE, and we can see something happening to the fan photo class, that there's kind of new subclasses appearing with which are kind of shown in a way to display that they're actually being used by a minority of users, so a tentative sort of subclassification. After some time, developers and evaluators need back to kind of go through this data again, And we see the kind of subclusters appearing and fragmenting. And also we start to notice that users have actually named for themselves one of their clusters Fanbook, the one that was using that Facebook connection. And they like the name, we might not. So what? We can work with that and take the cluster as a practical definition of a new subclass. An example is because people have chosen this kind of way. It's a very, very simple first example of human intervention in this process of adaptation of class population. I'm kind of seeing this here partly because what would be the right name for this may not be up to us, and certainly is not something you can define automatically. More generally, it's a trivial example, I just don't believe that automatic or autonomic approaches to adaptation have a place here. Human knowledge and intervention appear to be needed in order to make high-level design decisions about not only simple things like a good name of a cluster and the fit of a newly available component with an individual's future context and uses, but also decisions about issues such as the likely effects on social interaction and the priorities and costs of the work of system maintenance and development. I think that's never going to be done automatically. As you're going to go on, there are people working on this code, give their own name for the mannet using class, Zippy. And then, as the developer kind of opens up his IDE again, we see the code defining a new subclass appearing, labeled with the origins of these names, and also links back to the data, the clusters of instances that led to them. So the Objective-C code for this app, for Fanbook and Zippy, is now available for inspection and editing, like any other code really, which again allows the design of new components tailored to each subcluster or subclass, leading on to new uses and adaptations in the future. Okay, I want to just kind of try and step back again and sort of begin to wrap up a little bit by going up a level. We're talking about populations with family resemblances and drawing on a lot of history really about not only conceptual and theoretical work, but experimental work, especially in the 70s by people such as Roche and Mervis, about how people develop names for categories for things in the world. And necessary and sufficient properties, defining properties, not how people do it. In general, this idea of family resemblance seems to be a much more kind of powerful and common tool for doing that. Applying family resemblance has been done before in a number of computer science areas, but not to software structures, as far as we know. It raises the difficult questions about established paradigms and practices. One has to ask how such software comes to be varied, who makes it, who makes the variations, who controls the ends and means of such a change. And that's really what our project's about in some sense. It's about broadening out from just the technical issues and from mathematics and logic alone to socio-technical design that involves coherently combining new software representations, tools to support the tasks of varied individuals, and those individuals' social interaction. In that sense, the population approach is all about socio-technical design, designing low-level representations and making sure that they are conceptually solid, tools to use those things, but also social interactions and practices that involve in those tools that feed back into low-level representations of what people have actually been doing. So, just to give examples of the kind of tools, kind of analyses we expect to be able to try and support. Some are kind of driven much more by the user, by users themselves, asking them, for example, how does my setup compare to my friends? Are the configurations like my own that doesn't crash so much? And how are they used? Those kind of things. We expect also to be driving things using what are often called lead users, people we've found in the past are very keen to try out new versions of code, but also perhaps exposing our sort of design approach to other people who might actually contribute new modules, contribute software to the overall design process. I'm going to just jump past a little bit because I don't want to kind of inhibit things too much. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes that I'm not going to get into about extending our prior work on data visualization, statistical analysis, as well as kind of application design to fit with this kind of thing. One of the partners down in London is working on statistical analysis to do two main things: ways to find significant family resemblances amongst large dynamic populations of software instances, and also this kind of thing which drives back into the software design process again, reducing a chosen subset of software instances into representative code and usage data in a way that can be used inside something like an IDE. We're also doing formal modeling to kind of take that kind of probabilistic model I just described in the previous slide to understand application for performance and robustness, and also to kind of make that kind of comprehensible in some way. The huge design challenge here is how to feed that back into end-user applications, not just evaluators and developers tools, but things which are accessible and allow communication, in effect, between users, evaluators, and developers. So this kind of loop we're trying to get to here, to make deploy an app at a large scale, collect log data, do this kind of statistical analysis, make formal models on it, to understand things like failures and exceptions, and feed them back into the tools that people have for awareness analysis, and support people in all these roles in adapting the application, but also its use. So what I'm trying to contrast here is this, in software engineering here, we'll use this word ontology in a way to define a sort of structure, as I've kind of drawn this definition from semantic web. But I think the big problem here is the way that in computer science, ontology tends to mean this idea of a one structure for all known uses, contexts, and people. And it's a tremendously difficult, slippery thing to try and define. And adaptation is the problem of changing that thing. What we're trying to handle is actually, I think, a more up-to-date idea of what an ontology is. Ontology is a process which couples process and structure. You have structure, which is a resource for use, which in turn creates or adapts that structure into the future. And there are philosophical and sociological sort of landmarks for this kind of work early on. And especially in ubiquitous and mobile computing, where context and use are continually changing, I think this is kind of an important sort of design requirement, is to actually understand and design for this overall process. And so we're trying to kind of get to this thing where we move from structure to use through deployment. We compile code and users run it. The big new trick is how to move back again, making code for a class from a set of instances. And it's that, going around that loop, that process, that will support the gradual adaptation of a class, going in between different forms of class definition, and then in between different people involved. So it's the circular process. We're trying to design for change and co-creation with people being heavily involved in every step, involved in multiple representations of software class, including a new stochastic or probabilistic one, but tools are based on those representations, but also trying to design and encourage social interaction that helps that and makes that kind of process be good for the people involved. Feedback into the low-level representations again. Okay, thank you.